Hey, welcome back to day 4 of our Flutter Advent Christmas project. I don't really have a great name for it, but we're going to keep going. So yesterday we did a lot of refactoring. We took our giant widget tree and broke it apart into a separate view. And then we wrote a custom view model implementation for that view to help manage the state. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, and hopefully you are too. So today we're going to add some interactivity to our application, and we'll just jump into that and get started. Great. So, okay, I can see my screen. So we left off yesterday with changing this icon to an edit icon. So we should see a pencil down here. I think this was our quote from yesterday. So I'm going to refresh the, restart the application. And yeah, I just wanted to make sure we had another quote. So this looks a little weird. We'll try to clean this up soon, but let's focus on interactivity first, and then we'll worry about the design later. Okay, so what do we want to do? We want to make this button do something, and this button is going to prompt the user to give their thoughts. So to get started with this, we're going to go ahead and write everything inside of this onPressed listener, and we'll refactor it out, kind of like we did yesterday, once we hit the point where it works. So we're going to use a bottom sheet. So we want to show bottom sheet. We have the option to show a bottom sheet or show a modal bottom sheet. So let's see if we can figure out what the difference is. A modal bottom sheet is an alternative to a menu or a dialog that prevents the user from interacting with the rest of the app. That sounds like what we might actually want, right? Let's give that a shot. So we have a context and we have a builder. We've used builder functions so far. This one's going to be a little different. It actually just takes in a context. And the ones up here, for example, in the stream builder also had a snapshot passed into them. That's not the case with the bottom sheet builder. And that's because this bottom sheet builder is just executing a bottom sheet. It's not based off of data like our stream builder. So our stream builder is retriggering every time this data changes, the snapshot. There's not really any data relevant for our bottom sheet behavior. We'll plug some stuff into it, but it's not relevant for how it renders, or if it should render, I suppose. Okay, so we're going to show a bottom sheet. I'm just going to go ahead and put some text in here. So let's bottom sheet. Okay. Now if we pull this up and we hit this button, okay, our bottom sheet's right there. It's tiny. So let's make this a little bit better, right? So instead of just returning text, we can return, let's start with a container. And this will have a child, and that'll be the text. Let's see what that gives us. Okay, still kind of the same, but we can give this container like a height, for example. And then maybe we want this to be based off the size of the screen, right? So we can use media query.of context.size.height. And then maybe we want this to be like a 4/5 the size of the screen. Let's give this a shot. Okay, this is feeling better. But we also probably want to give this a width so it takes up the full size, right? So we can do media query .of context. And this is a lookup. This is a little bit, you would consider this to be an expensive operation. So we don't want to write that twice back to back. Instead, we can do final MQ is equal to media query of context. And then we can reference that MQ variable. It's not very likely to change between, oops, sorry, we want the width to be the full size. It's not very likely to change between executing it on this line and this line. But the lookup itself is kind of expensive, so instead of doing that twice, we'll just do that once. Okay, cool. Yeah, this is starting to look like a bottom sheet. Fantastic. So maybe we want to add a couple things to clean this up a little bit, like we can add padding. So in Dart, we can use edge insets. Sorry, in Flutter, we can use edge insets And we want to add padding to all the sides, so maybe we do 8 and see what that gives us. Okay, cool. The word bottom sheet's no longer leaking out of the bottom sheet. That's a good start. So I'm going to put this in a column. I'll show you something neat we haven't talked about yet. If you're using VS Code, you can use code actions. So I've got my cursor on text. I'm going to hit Command dot, or you can hover over this, scroll, hover over this, scroll all the way down, hit Quick Fix. Oh no, that doesn't solve it. You might not be able to do it with the quick fix, but if you do command actions, you have options here like wrap with column, which is what we're going to use right here. So that wraps this in a column. I'm going to change the word bottom sheets to what are your thoughts on this quote? So we hot refreshed, and our application didn't update. What? That's crazy, right? That's not Flutter. Flutter's supposed to update when we do that. So the reason this didn't update is because this bottom sheet content is generated when we execute the show modal bottom sheet. So this, despite us updating the value here, the structure of this, it's not, oops, that's the wrong thing. It's not, get out of there. Okay. Cool. It's not going to change until we don't have to reload the application, but we do have to rebuild the bottom sheet. So if you ever run into that issue and you're working with like bottom sheets or scaffold messengers or things like that, anything that's triggered in reaction to interaction, so like an on-press listener, and you hot refresh and it doesn't update the content, you probably just need to trigger the interactive element again. Okay, so we have what are your thoughts on this quote? That's great, but we don't actually have a space for them to share their thoughts, right? So we can do like a text. Oh my gosh, I'm going to pull up the documentation. It's slipping my mind, so let's pull it up and find it. Flutter widget catalog. Okay. Good old uBlock. Great, so input is what we want. And we could use a form. In theory, you probably should use a form in most of these cases. Since we're really only taking one piece of input, it's probably not necessary. So in fact, I actually clicked on input, which is more form related. I wanted material components. So we can see here, hey, there's that floating action button that we're using, and it even has a pencil, just like ours. But what we really want to find is selection, text inputs, all the way at the bottom. Okay, so we have a text field, right? One of the nice things about the Flutter documentation is that you can actually run a little application to see what this looks like here to figure out if it is the right component for you, or if maybe it's not the right component for you. It's taking a minute to run. Oh, it just showed up for a second. Okay, so it says password. Great. So we might be curious, like, what does this look like if instead of it showing a password, are we not able to change this? Okay. Yeah, there we go. So instead of it showing a password that's 250 length, it's 450. And instead of it saying password, say hidden input or something. And then if we run this again, it'll update. This is a little weird and off topic, I guess, but the point is that if you want to see what a component looks like and kind of tinker with it before actually pulling it into your application or using it in your application, you can do that from the Flutter documentation, and it works really well. Okay, there are more values too, so there's, or more examples. So you can see reading values using an onSubmitted callback. There's also an option for something called a text editing controller. We can use either of those. Generally, a text editing controller is more reactive, so you can listen to that controller, and then every time that text changes, so every single keystroke, for example, that listener could be called. We don't necessarily care for that, so we'll probably use the onSubmitted callback. onSubmitted callback. But to do that, I think we also need to wrap it in a form. So we shall see. Okay. I was looking for a couple more examples to see if we had something really close to what we were looking for, but I don't seem to see one. So we'll explore and find it ourselves. So we want a text field. And these are some of the options that we have available to our text field. We can also see them back here. There are decorations. I think we'll try without a decoration and see what it looks like for our needs. And run with that. So we have a text field. I do want to see what our options are here, so I'm going to command click into this, and we can see that these are all the things we can pass into our text field. And you can see this .controller is an example. So that was the text editing controller that I was talking about. Let's go ahead and refresh and see what this looks like. Okay, cool. So we have a space for our thoughts. So we can actually type here, and then maybe we want to add, maybe we want to add a button underneath that says submit. So yeah, oh, what a silly habit. So button doesn't exactly exist in Flutter. Let's go back to the widget catalog one more time to talk about this. The reason why button doesn't exist as is because there's multiple types of buttons, and there's not just button. So there's material button, there's some of these changed with material 3, so I hesitate to give you the exact name that I'm thinking of because I don't want to give you the wrong one. But icon button, segmented button, extended floating action button, that's nice. So there's elevated buttons, filled buttons, tonal filled buttons, outlined button, and text button. In our case, we will probably, let's see what an elevated button looks like, but we might just use a text button. So we can add an elevated button. It's going to have an on-press listener, just like the floating action button right here. We'll fill that out in a minute. So for now, let's give this a child of text that says submit. Okay, let's trigger this again. That doesn't look too bad, actually. Maybe we'll keep that. And because it's a material button, you get these nice ink drop or inkwell interactions. Okay, so we have an interesting predicament. These things are stacked on top of each other. So we have a couple different options here. We can play around with the column and do main axis alignment and do something like main axis alignment dot space evenly. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, that's maybe not too bad. It's also maybe not too good. And I kind of like the fact that the bottom sheet's as big as it is. So let's maybe not take that approach, and let's talk about some other approaches. So we can use flex to decide how much, describing flex is actually kind of difficult, but it's a flexible area and they are given weights. So some things can flex more than others. Some things will flex less than others, and then you can define specific rulings to handle how things do flex or how things don't flex. So that would be an option. So in our case, we could make this, for example, we could make the text flexible. Let's load this again. Okay, so it flexes a little bit, but it doesn't take up too much space, so it's not actually going to impact the others much. So really, I think what we might want to do in this case is there's a couple different options. We could wrap all of these in containers and give them a height, just like you have here. If you're doing that and you're not adding extra things like padding or decorations, it would be better to use a sized box instead of a container. Or we could also add a sized box in between these fields to take up space, just an empty sized box. So if we do height 20, and then maybe let's copy that again and put that under this text field, save it, And let's open this up, and now we should see there's a little bit more space between everything. Another option is that we could add extra padding. So we could take this text widget, I'm going to use a code action, and we could hit wrap with padding. And maybe we don't want edge insets all, maybe we want only top. So add some more padding to the top of this. Great. Actually, I kind of like that. Let's style this text a little bit. So we're going to add a style property, and we're going to use text style. And maybe we want the font size to be higher. So you can see this is the size of the fonts in logical pixels to use when painting the text. Matches the dimension of the M square of the underlying font, and more often than not isn't exactly the height or widths. During painting, the font size is multiplied by the text scale factor. That's really important. So people who have accessibility needs might use a high text scale factor on their mobile application, and that means that your font will be multiplied by that text scale factor. So for example, your grandparents might use a 1.8 scale factor. So everything is 1.8 times as big as it is when you're looking at it with a 1.0 scale factor. They can be higher. There's a lot of flexibility with that, and it's something you probably want to be aware of, because for certain people, in fact, a large number of people, your application may not look exactly like you expected it to. Let's give this a value. I'm thinking 24, just a random number. Okay, that looks all right. It's maybe a little not what I had in mind, but let's take it down to 20 pixels or 20 units. That's fine. I'm going to pad this a little bit more. So I'm actually going to change this back to all, and then remove the top here and pad all of it by 8, so it's a little further in from the sides. Okay, that looks pretty good. We can tinker with this a little bit more. So if we look at some of the options we have for style, we have color, background color, font size, font weight, letter spacing, word spacing, height, locale, font features, text decoration, so many different options. Font family, a lot of really good options here. We also have some options in text, right? So we can make this wrap, we can make this overflow, we can define a text scale factor here. If we wanted to override, I think that's overriding the existing one from the operating system. So for whatever reason, if you don't want to use the one from the operating system, which you probably don't want to do, you could override that. The max number of lines, so if we were like, no, this can't wrap and it needs to stay on one line, regardless of text scale factor, we could set that here. Okay, I'm going to make some of these const because the blue lines are starting to stress me out. And this one's interesting. This one is const, but it's telling me that I need to remove the const keyword because it's unnecessary. The reason it's unnecessary is because the parent is const. This does not have to be const. Okay, and then right here, make that const. Okay, this is fine. I don't care for this font per se, so that might be something we explore, and maybe we'll use like Google Fonts to change this font at some point. But for now, we want to say something like, well, what are your thoughts on this quote? This is a really nice quote. And then we hit submit, and something needs to happen. We haven't written any code to do that yet, so let's go ahead and do that now. I do think we are going to use a text editing controller. The more I think about it, the more I like that idea. So we're in our quote view. Up here, all the way at the top of our state, we can type final. We need to give this a good name, and naming is always hard. Journal entry controller equals text editing controller. Let's go with that. So now we can take our journal entry controller, come back down to our text field, and pass that in for the controller property. Oh, this is important. This is an invalid constant value. This isn't constant. There's no way this could be constant. So since it's being, like I just said earlier, this doesn't need to be constant because the parent is, which means this is, it implies that this is also constant. Since this can't be constant, the parent also can't be constant. So we can fix that by removing the constant on the text field. Okay, and now what I want to do is I'm just going to print line. Oh man, sorry, print. I've been writing a lot of JavaScript lately. Journal entry controller dot text. So now we have something working. We're not actually going to see it on the screen. I'll show you exactly where you can find it in just a second. So we have, what are your thoughts on this quote? This is good. Now if we hit submit, you can see in the background right here, we can see that this is good. The reason that we're testing this like so is we just want to make sure that our text editing controller is, or sorry, our journal entry controller, which is a text editing controller, is wired up properly before we move on to anything further. So we're calling print on that to make sure we can get the actual text value that the user has input. Okay, we got what we needed. We know that we've written a view model for this quote view, right? So we have a quote view model dot, let's give this a new method. We're going to call it submit entry. And we have a couple options here. We could always pass in the date if we wanted to allow people to like calendar hop and put feedback on maybe days that they forgot to pull up the application, or maybe they want to get ahead of it. We could always support that. And maybe that's something we'll do in the future. We've talked about that a little bit too. But for now, we know that submit entry will just look at the current date whenever this is called and use that value. So we have quote view model submit entry, and we want the journal entry controller dot text. Now this is red because we haven't built this yet. If we quick fix this, we can hit create method submit entry. It'll open our view model. Oh, it did not. It will add the method to our view model. It didn't open it for me. So if you don't use the code action, make sure you add this. And we need to do something with it, right? So we'll want to save this to a database. And I don't know if we'll get to that today, but we can talk a little bit about the database we're going to use, and then we can definitely get there tomorrow. So I really like a database called Hive. So I'm going to pull up Flutter Hive. In fact, it's not Flutter specific. You can just use it in Dart too, which is really nice. But we're going to pull up the documentation for it. And tomorrow, I guess, we will start to install this and work with that. For now, let's see, is there anything else we want to do today? So we have our main Dart, we have our quote view model. Oh, I have an idea. This is really big, and this is really specific. Let's refactor this into its own widget. So one of the nice things we can do is we can actually grab this, right-click, refactor, and then we can hit extract widget. This will pull it out all on its own for us, which is really nice. We might have to tinker with it. It doesn't always come up with the best widget interface, so we can change that as we go. But we know that this is going to be called like feedback form. Hey, that's actually pretty good. So this feedback form has a journal entry controller that gets passed to it and a quote view model for updating the data. This maybe isn't the best thing. We don't necessarily need to control the text at this level. In fact, it could be controlled at the feedback form level. And on top of that, our view model doesn't really need to be passed in, and instead we could just give a reference to our view model. So let's do that, right? So we have our feedback form down here. We'll pull this out to its own file in a minute. And until then, we don't need this quote view model, and we don't need the text editing controller. Instead, what we want to do is have a function. So we'll define a function. This will be a void function, so this won't return a type. And it will take in, what will it take in? That's a great question. It'll take in the string text, And then this will be on text submit. And we want to make this required, so this will be required dot on text submit. Okay. And we can make this final so that this can be constant. Remember, if we use a const constructor, we have to make our properties final. So now, instead of this right here, we can instead call, on text submit. And we need to pass in the value, right? So we'll have to figure out how we're going to get the value. So we have a couple different options. We can wrap all this in a form if we wanted to take that approach, where the onSubmitted value will be triggered, like passed to the form. We could use a text editing controller. I think I'll probably lean towards that. The tricky part here is that this needs to become a stateful widget for us to use a text editing controller. So let's go ahead and change that. This is actually not a terrible change. So this will be a stateful widget. And then we can look at our existing stateful widget to see what this needs to do. So it needs to create state. And it's not going to be quote view state, right? Instead, we want feedback form state. And this will be state for feedback form. This will have to come up here. And this will need to come up here. This needs to be renamed to feedback form. And now that we're here, this gets to be empty. In fact, we actually don't need this, right? We can't have a constant constructor. So we don't need to define a constructor in that case, and it'll use an implicit one. So now that we have this, we can go grab our journal entry controller. I'm going to cut this and remove it from that widget and add it to our state. We don't need to initialize this with like an init state method. In our case, the text editing controller's default value, which is empty, is fine. If we wanted to add some text to it, we could. And there might be a scenario where, again, if we supported calendar hopping and you could go to a previous date, you might want to load the text editing controller with the value the user put in there previously. We'll see if we get to that. We can make this const. We'll just clean up as we go. And now we know that this needs to be on text submit journal entry controller .text. So this will grab the text from that journal entry controller and trigger on text submit. The caveat here is we move this out of this widget. Well, sort of. When we change this to a state, this widget piece, this component to a state, we elevated on text submit to the widget that has the state. So in our case, we just say widget.onTextSubmit. If that's a little confusing, one thing that can help is if you hold down Command and click on a Mac or Control click on Windows, it'll take you to where that's defined. And you can see here, feedback form has that on text submit. Let's continue to use that up here. So we have on text submit. We want to do something, right? This is going to be our text. And in our case, we want to call quote view model dot submit entry text. There we go. Now we've cleaned this up. I just ran into an error, compile time lookup. So because I was converting things from stateless widgets to stateful widgets, sometimes you can get in this error state when you hot reload. So a restart should take care of it. So let's go ahead and do that. Stateful widget create state must return a subtype of state feedback form. Quote view state. So we have a bug. Let's fix that. Oh, yeah, it's returning quote view state, which is the one up here. So in our case, we want to grab this and return feedback form state. Change that to feedback form. And then generally the convention is to make the state private. So we'll put an underscore to make the state private. Let's make sure this still works. I'll give this one more reload. Okay, cool. That does work. Now that we've extracted that out, part of the reason we pulled things out the way that we did is that functions are they're not exactly anonymous, but they don't carry a lot of weight to them. They're very flexible. Where if we passed in that view model and that text editing controller, that carries a lot of weight to it. It's very specific about how it can be used. Functions are very, very flexible. So part of the reason we pulled that out and refactored it to take in a function the way that we did is because now this is really easy to move to its own file where it's not aware of any of the stuff that's defined in this file. So let's do that. We're going to create a new file under quotes called feedback form.dart, and we're just going to paste. Again, we have some red squiggles. This is because we're missing imports for things like Flutter. And actually, I think that's the only thing we were missing. So we can save this, and you see that we have an error down here. It doesn't know what feedback form is. That's because we moved it out of that file and into this file. So if we go back to that file, the quote view, we can find our red squiggles right here. And the issue is that we're not importing our new widget. So if we use code actions or add this import to the top of the file and hit enter, we're good to go. One more reload, make sure everything still works. Awesome, we're here, everything seems to still be working. And our view model is where we will pick up tomorrow, and we'll actually save this to a database, or we'll start on the process of saving that to a database. These are running about 30 minutes. It might take a couple days to actually get through with that. Okay. Hope you found this one valuable. We're starting to get into like a full functioning application at this point. We just need to do something with that data. And then we want to show that data too. So we'll have to write some code to show that data whenever we have data for a given quote. So if you gave me feedback, or if you, not me, sorry, I'm not collecting any of this data, there's no accounts, nothing. If you added that data to your phone, your device, for that quote the last time it came around, we want you to be able to review that and reflect on it. Maybe your opinions have changed, maybe they're the same. It might be nice to know either way. I think that's going to cover it for our video today. I mentioned a couple videos ago that I was trying to be monetized or achieve monetization on YouTube, so I could do more of this. And so many people have been very kind and subscribed, and I've had a couple people reach out and share the videos, and it warms my heart to know that people are doing that. So I really appreciate you all, and hopefully you learned something today. Thanks.